It's a neat topic that I don't think we can discuss enough, and it's the as-is contract. I'm not even going to talk about the standard contract. There's going to be some things that I reference that are going to be, I'm naturally going to reference to a standard contract, both FAR/BAR and NABOR. But really what I want to look at is, let's just look at as-is contracts. And if you've talked with me before, you probably know that I am a big fan. For some context, I practiced in Atlanta for about 10 years before moving back to Florida. And in Atlanta, the standard contract is actually the as-is. And it's a little deceiving in the name. I think that's the first thing we have to discuss, is that, yes, it's an as-is contract, but it doesn't mean that you have to buy it as is. It just means that the seller is not going to be obligated to do repairs or to give credits when they find a defect. It can still be negotiated, and in fact, usually it is, but there's no obligation. So that's really the difference between the standard and the as-is, is that the standard would say, all right, the seller might have an obligation to repair defects, like the FAR/BAR contract, right, Dad?
Yeah, exactly.
So in a FAR/BAR standard contract, the seller is obligated to do repairs if they fit within the defective items under the prescribed limit.
And they have repair limits in paragraph 9, for general repair items, for wood destroying organisms, and permits. So they break it down. And the default is 1.5% of the purchase price.
So if you have a $1 million sale, 1.5% is 15,000. So you'd have 15,000 for
general repair items, 15,000 for permits, and the other ones for termites. So it could be 45 grand for.
It could be 45, and it probably isn't, because usually you don't have 1.5% of repairs on each of those three. Yeah. So, but I mean, that's a pretty rude awakening. And in my opinion, that's a risk to any agent that's using a standard contract, especially if it's a Naples agent who's not used to using FAR/BAR, and they walk in, they use a FAR/BAR standard, and all of a sudden the seller is obligated. It says seller shall up to that prescribed limit. That could be a pretty rude awakening. I've certainly been, critiqued or maybe even yelled at when I haven't told a client the full story, or haven't educated them well enough. So I always fear that could happen on a standard contract, especially the FAR/BAR. Now, the NABOR doesn't have that obligation, but it still feels like it does. There's like this perception that the seller is obligated to do these.
It's customary, people think I think sellers almost think they're obligated to. They don't fully appreciate that they can say no.
Even I think the agents feel like they might be obligated.
A lot of them, because in all fairness, it's a lengthy contract. Used to be 1 page, now it's 13, and it's complex. It just is.
Yeah. Well, I started off by saying I wasn't going to talk much about the standard, but I couldn't help myself.
That's all you're talking about, Christian.
All right, so let's think about the as-is as the alternative. Now, the big disclaimer, and I know every one of you who's watching is thinking the same thing. A lot of listing agents don't want you to make your offer on an as-is contract. There's this, mindset that, we want a standard. We want a standard. Now, the reason they would want a standard, Dad, what do you think? What's your opinion on why a listing agent or a seller might prefer a standard over something else?
Well, the power of saying no is in their hands. They can say no, and the buyer doesn't have the unilateral right to cancel unless the seller says no to something that's a defective item as defined in the NABOR contract. So it's customary. People feel more secure with it, and it's the seller who controls whether we say yes or no, and always with an eye on whether the second deposit was put down.
Yeah, there's a lot of strategy involved. And so that's the disclaimer, that obviously if you're making an offer on a property and the listing agent says, look, we want a standard contract, you might be doing yourself a disservice by only offering on an as-is. So I'll put that out there so that you guys don't have to correct me later. But if you have the opportunity, if the listing agent doesn't have a preference, for a buyer, we like the as-is contract. Ed, you always said that if it was my family, I would want them signing an as-is contract as a buyer.
Well, again, I mean, we're from all over the country. Your wife's from Long Island. I just want to make sure my family is happy. I don't care what the contract says. And then there's medical issues that your family has. You know, if somebody has respiratory issues, I don't care if it's allergenic mold. That's an issue for me. So an as is in that situation is huge. And I got to say, Christian, you're converting me to the virtues of the as is, because I'm negotiating on behalf of a listing agent now, and the realtor on the other side is your buddy Riley. Disclaimer, that's Mike Hughes' nephew. And I'm saying as is, make it 7 days, keep an eye on the effective date. You don't want it to hit, the final date to hit the weekend. You're in, you're out in 1 week. You'll know one way or another in 1 week whether this buyer's buying.
So let's talk about that. That's a great point. So the first thing to discuss is timelines. So why would I want an as-is contract? Number one is timelines. When I make an offer or when I receive an offer, I count weekends. How many weekends am I going to be off the market? Because that's something I use to sell the seller on accepting the deal. So if it's let's say, today's Wednesday. So today, if today was the effective date, that's day 0. And let's give ourselves a 7-day inspection period. So fast forward, we're, 7 days forward, it's next Wednesday would be my last day to do inspections and negotiate repairs under a standard contract or an as-is contract. That's as-is FAR/BAR or NABOR, very easy. Now, in that scenario, I've counted 1 weekend. So if I go to my seller, I say, look, he's got 1 weekend where you're going to be off the market. And it's almost June, or it will be June shortly. This isn't a bad deal for you, seller. Let's go ahead and accept it if the other terms are acceptable. Alternatively, and that's the as-is contracts. Alternatively, on a standard NABOR contract, if I gave you that same 7 days, I am also then going to get a 5-day election period. Right. So 7 days brings me to Wednesday, and then Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday, Monday. I have until Monday. So now I'm counting 2 weekends where the seller is potentially off the market. And I think that's a big positive for using an as-is contract. Now, the FAR/BAR doesn't work that way. FAR/BAR, it's all has to be negotiated within that inspection period. So you may not have that same argument, but as is really straightforward. You got 7 days. I can easily count a weekend.
You've converted me. I've got to say, and it's not just for family,
15
friends.
months.
I got Riley on one side representing the buyer, and the owner is a realtor and the listing agent. And I'm explaining to the listing agent, you're going to know in a week, and you time the second deposit at the end of that due diligence period too. So you're going to have the money down, and you're going to know whether they're in or out in 1 week versus 20 days with the standard NABOR. Theoretically, the buyer could take 20 days.
Yeah,
and big difference.
So that's a big one. Remember, it's calendar days on either FAR/BAR or NABOR. And the day you go under contract is day 0. We did a whole class on timelines. You might want to brush up on that if you haven't watched that. So that's a big one. And I definitely like that. It's something that I can easily propose to a seller and say, look, you got to do it. And as part of that, remember on an as-is contract, and this is something that you have to kind of trigger in your brain, there's no election period in an as-is contract. And potentially that could be a downside for a buyer. I could see that. You don't have as much time to gather, estimates and invoices and put together your forms. So for a buyer, that might be a downside. But that's an upside for a seller because you've got a shorter time frame, no election period. And for a little bit of context, I mentioned that I practiced in Atlanta. We can get it done. I promise you. You can do inspections and put together the amendment in 7 to 10 days most of the time. And if you needed more time because of some scheduling conflict or the seller's not available, whatever it may be, we can negotiate for more. But usually I try and keep it under 10 days. 5, 7, 10-day mark, as is contract, keep it simple, helps the seller. Remember, counting weekends.
Oh, and with the one I'm doing now, Christian, it's a condo, it's on the beach, southern exposure, and it's the only condo in that building that's on the market. So the seller doesn't want it off the market for a long time. They want that second deposit down quickly. And they don't want to get in a big argument over whether something's defective or not. They want to know, is the buyer in or out, and we're timing it so they got 1 week period, end of story.
Yeah, and actually it's a good transition. The condo is a really good point. Under the condo review period, it's an as-is contract anyways, for minimum of 3 days.
Yeah. And honestly, stretch out is probably the wrong word, but by the time we accumulate all the required documents, it's not unusual for it to be 7 days for the condo review. It really isn't.
Well, and I think if I'm listing a condo, I'm going to want an as-is contract because I'm giving them a condo review period anyways by law. So instead of a 3-day as-is, let's give them 7. Now we're really, limiting, or even, again, we're counting weekends. I'll give them 9, get you to Friday. I know by Friday night whether we have a deal or not, hopefully sooner. So that's not a huge trade-off to me, as opposed to you're giving them the as-is plus then the standard and the election period and all that. So that's a positive to a seller. If it's a condo, something to consider, something to think about.
It's the only one in the building. It's a good exposure. It's a premium property.
Yeah, you're counting
not a lot of bickering.
You have. And the other side of it is, I do think that as a seller, I always wanted my buyer to have an inspection period. I think, or at least the right to do an inspection. So even if you waive your contingency and you don't have an inspection contingency, I kind of want the buyer to have a look. I expect them to ask. So that's another thing. Even if it's multiple offer and you could negotiate where they could do that, maybe it makes sense to give it to them anyways as like a goodwill. And Dad, you've always talked about that. It's a good strategy.
I'm telling you, on top of that, Christian, all the Johnson v. Davis cases that I read on your obligation to disclose, the courts always talk about whether or not the seller gave the buyer a chance to look. As part of that test is, if the buyer had done an inspection, would they have found whatever it is? That's the definition of latent, roughly. So taking away that makes you more susceptible to being attacked on a failure to disclose properly.
Right.
So it kind of protects the seller in a way by saying, you should have picked up on this. If you had done an inspection, you cheaped out, you didn't want to do it. But if you had done it, you would have found it. Therefore, I'm not liable for you under the disclosure cases.
Love it. It just says participant, but someone raised their hand. Do you want to ask your question? If you want to ask a question, go ahead and unmute yourself, and then you could go ahead and ask it. So we talk about the inspections, the periods involved at that, how you count the timelines. Again, you guys will have to unmute yourself if you want to participate. I would love to hear some feedback. The other thing to think about is, all right, here we go. Go ahead.
I'm here. Can you hear me now,
Yes,
Christian?
I can. It's perfect.
Okay, this is Beth Schultz, and I'm using this as-is contract.
Perfect.
And
Real world
I
scenario.
had the unit came through. I'm representing the buyer, and the unit came through as having radon. And so now the seller, because it was a holiday weekend and extended, she did not have time to get information about the radon. So she asked last night for the extension of the due diligence period, which is fine. I just want to confirm we did this. The seller's agent wanted to make this change on an amendment, and I'm like, no, it needs to be on an addendum. And I said, no, it needs to be on the amending of the contract. Am I correct on that? Because that's what we used.
I would say you're correct. That being said, it probably isn't worth fighting them on it. Either one would work. Wouldn't you agree, Dad?
Yeah, the court's going to look at the substance. I mean, that's something lawyers get excited about. Amendment is a change. You're technically correct. Addendum is something you're adding to it. But in the real world, when you're before a judge, they're looking at what was in that document. What did you do? Oh, you extended the due diligence in paragraph 8 to Monday, and they're going to go with that. They don't care if you call it potato.
Yeah, that's one of those things, Beth, that you can be the one that says, okay, we'll do it your way, whatever. It honestly, I would say most places around the country, they only have one of those. They only have an amendment available, because the amendment probably more, overarching than either the addendum would have been, but either one, you're fine.
Yeah, I mean, if
Okay,
you're gonna
'cause
pick a fight, I wouldn't pick it over that.
Yeah. I'll fight with people, just not on that one.
Yeah.
Well,
pick a-
the concerning portion was is she wanted, we had timed it so after the inspection on day 11, they were adding another 12,500, but she wanted to leave that in place. And I'm like, well, wait a minute, you know, we don't want to be stuck had we used the wrong contract. I wasn't sure legally. So basically I did the amendment, like the correct document.
Yep,
And she wasn't arguing, and I extended the second deposit on it too. Everybody signed off on it. We have another
Right.
7 days.
perfect. Love it. Good job.
Okay.
Good job. And actually, it's a perfect transition because the next thing I wanted to talk about is, okay, we've decided to do an as-is contract. How do we use this form? Because I'm not used to it. And the answer is, you're going to use an addendum or an amendment. You're going to do your inspections, get all the things together that you're wanting to ask for, and then you're going to get a blank amendment, and you'll say seller shall complete the following items at or prior to closing at its sole cost and expense. And then I just bullet point all the things that the seller is going to do. Repair the screen, replace the roof, give buyer a credit of $3,000 towards closing costs. And then you have everyone sign it and keep it simple. The only thing that I find we could play more on, we could add more information is, well, what happens if the seller doesn't do something? You have any additions you would add to that, Dan?
Well, if there's a mortgage involved, you got to be very careful because the bank doesn't want to see that you're doing any repairs at all. They live in fantasy land, no offense to Kent. They want to make believe it's a vanilla loan, that the property is perfect, and they don't want to see an escrow or a credit for repairs. So the escrow or credit would be for closing costs, prepaids, and escrows. And I always tell the buyers, check with your loan officer and see if that's acceptable language to them and their underwriters. Because each bank varies. I mean, most of them go with that, but some don't. So you just got to double check.
And it kind of works the same with that buyer election form. If there are things that are, if you're negotiating a credit, the lenders are going to freak out when they see what it's for. So you kind of have to ask in advance. And so I usually suggest call the lender and tell them, here's what we need to do. That way it's not in writing because they're in fantasy land. Call the lender. Hey, here's what we need to do. What do you recommend? What will pass on your guys' side of things?
Yeah, don't surprise your lender. Keep them in as part
Keep
of
them in the loop. Ask them in advance because they can tell you how to fit it within the guidelines. And to that point, Dad, I had a closing. Unfortunately, it fell apart. But they did inspections. They found some pretty major issues, and there was about a $40,000 credit that the seller wanted to give the buyer. And the buyer was then going to go use that money to do the repairs. And they did, they needed the money to do the repairs. Well, it was maybe like a $400,000 or $500,000 purchase. There was a loan, and $40,000 was never going to be allowed by the lender.
It's more than 6% of the loan.
Well, even if it wasn't, it also has to cover the closing costs. So the credit has to be for closing costs. It can't be more. So if you
it can be prepaids and escrows.
It could, but I mean, 40,000, that's a big number, and they kind of need it for the repairs, right? So what I had recommended, I said, look, you could probably take 10, maybe 12, 15,000 as a credit. Some of it you might be able to pay the vendors in advance, and the rest would have to be some sort of price reduction, which would reduce your loan amount. It's not exactly dollar for dollar that you could then use for repairs. But it was really, really tricky. And unfortunately, that's why the deal fell apart, because it just didn't work for that particular buyer. Now, if you had a buyer paying cash, wouldn't have been a problem. Or if you had a buyer getting maybe a 50% loan, some sort of small, tiny loan, then they could have taken a price reduction pretty easily. But that's something to consider. You call the lender, even if you have a listing agent, call the lender. Hey, here's what's going on. What do you recommend?
And the lender might take seller shall credit the buyer $40,000 at closing and not say what it's for. So that's why talking to your underwriter is so huge.
Yeah.
And then back to your point about how you had a really extensive inspection list. I mean, I get that now and then, and I tell my buyers, pick the top 5 things that mean the most to you. I mean, part of it is, what is the seller going to willingly accept? And we've written letters in the past where we notify the seller, my client wants a credit for these 5 things, so my buyer wants these 5 things fixed before closing. Otherwise, we hereby terminate the contract. Are they deal breaker items? Because you don't want to get caught using that buyer's election form and then commit malpractice, because there is no 5 days to cancel if the seller says no. I mean, the
Right.
seller will just let it run out.
So to that point, Dad, I'll put it in perspective for people. We had a deal where it was an as-is contract and they used the election form and both agents went along with it. And the buyer made their elections under the form. The seller was preparing a response. And then all of a sudden the attorney gets involved. It wasn't me, it was the seller's attorney gets involved.
You say that like it's a dirty word.
Don't use that form. Don't use the
It's in
form.
red ink not to use this form with an as-is contract. I mean,
So what happened is all of a sudden, now that the seller who was going to respond chose not to because their attorney advised them not to respond, the inspection period ran out. There was no election period that protected the buyer. The buyer has moved forward.
not lawyer.
Yeah, so the attorney was absolutely correct.
Yeah.
The only thing I did was I called the other attorney and said, hey, look, both agents were negligent. They both messed this up. Can we come back together? The seller was going to do some of these things. We have it in writing. How do we make this right? It was really challenging, and the agents were beating themselves up over it because it ended up coming out of their pocket. Because once the seller is told they don't have to do something, chances are they're not going to do it.
I know we've talked about this before, but the form not only has right on it not to use it with an as-is contract, but it has terms about defective items and so forth that are not in the as-is contract. So it's referring to things that don't exist in the contract.
Yeah.
So it makes the agent at a minimum look unprofessional.
Well, and just as a side point to that, you can't use the NABOR election form in a FAR bar contract because there's no election form or there's no election period in a FAR bar. So
plus they don't have defective items in the FAR bar. They have general repair items and in the other 2 categories. So it's different things and different elements to those things.
You might be able to borrow some of the language from those forms. I actually had someone doing that on an as-is, and they're taking language on what the seller is going to repair. I love that idea, but it has to be thoughtful and you have to go through it the right way. But no election form on as-is.
If you use the as-is, you don't have to worry about radon and mold not being a general repair item in FAR bar.
So I'll give you 2 more scenarios. They both are my personal deals. One deal, we went under contract. We had an as-is contract that did my inspections and mold came up high. And under a standard, we couldn't object to the mold because it was penicillin aspergillus. It's non-toxic. It's a allergenic mold. So, but it was an as-is. And because I had the ability to terminate for any reason, the seller had to take me seriously. The seller negotiated. We negotiated in good faith. Hey, this is what I want to do. This is the company I found to do the mediation. We need to replace the air conditioner, and then we're good. And the seller agreed, and I paid a piece of it. He paid everything else, and it worked. It was great. So that's an as-is contract where I negotiated repairs prior to the end of my inspection period. And if the seller did not agree to do it, then I would have had a decision to make. Do I move forward as is without, take it as is, I'll do the repairs myself, or do I walk? And this is something that people tend to overstate, in my opinion. Once buyers pay money to have inspections done, they're invested. The real risk is up front when they're making offers, and you don't know how many offers they made that weekend.
Right.
They might have made 10 offers and they this one and that, and you don't know if you're like the second option, third option, fourth option. To me, that's the risk of an as-is because they could back out. But once they start spending money and doing inspections, they're invested. They're just trying to make sure it is what it is. So as the second scenario from my personal house, we found the roof was leaking and we negotiated. It was a $40,000 credit to replace the roof. Now, the seller wasn't obligated to replace the roof, but I think he knew that if I walked away, then he would have to replace the roof. So he's like, look, this is, overall, is this still a good deal for me? I can't sell a house with a leaking roof to someone that needs to get insurance. It's just not going to work. So he gave me a credit, and I couldn't use the whole credit, just like in my client's situation. But I didn't need the money as much. I could afford to fix the roof, whether I got the full credit at closing or I got to use it towards paying down the purchase price. And so that's what we did. We did a hybrid. I think I took
You too,
10,000.
Christian, you have a doctor who was a seller in your case, and he knew you had 4 children. So I find that sellers, if you tell them more than what you want in terms of money and tell them, hey, we have health issues in the family, or I have children, that they tend to be more amenable to granting some sort of credit, addressing the
Can
issue.
be, absolutely.
It's not that you just reaching into their pocket. It's like you have a legitimate health concern about your family, and your sellers were very nice, husband and wife doctors who cared.
Well, and they were really tough negotiators. There were moments where I didn't know if they were going to do anything. And then they came back and they were very generous. But they could have said no, and I would have had to make a decision whether to move forward or not. But we ended up, I took $10,000 as a credit at closing, and that covered my closing costs. And the $30,000 remaining was used as a reduction of the purchase price. We just did a simple amendment. Seller shall give buyer credit of $10,000. Purchase price shall be, and it was the lower number. And that's what we went with. And it worked out great for me. But if you had a buyer that was not able to afford to do both the closing and the roof replacement, that may not have worked. And you might have had to get a little bit more aggressive. You might have been able to put a deposit down with the roofer. It just depends. It's hard to say exactly what you could have done. But here's the last part of it. It just is a full summary. As is contracts are, in my opinion, they're easier to count. There's no election period. It's calendar days, unless it falls on a weekend or holiday, then it rolls to the next business day.
Both contracts.
Remember that condos have an as-is period anyways, because there's that condo review period, minimum of 3 days. When you're talking about how you actually do it, I would use the as-is form. I try to stay away from the as-is addendums. I think that confuses everybody. So I try not to use the as-is addendums. I just use the as-is contracts. FAR/BAR and NABOR have separate ones. Don't use the election forms. That's kind of a disaster waiting to happen, although you could probably borrow language from it if you needed to. And then the last part, the key that I like about this is this keeps you out of realtor jail. And what I mean by that is, number one, you don't have to explain defect or cosmetic. You'll never have that discussion again.
Yeah.
You can still negotiate repairs. And it's easier to go between FAR/BAR and NABOR as is, because at that point, if you take away the repairs versus, the repair items, if you take away that distinction, the contracts become a lot more similar, a lot more easy to negotiate. There's still differences. We've done classes on the differences between the two, but this makes it more manageable. Someone did have a question. It said, are the condo review days in addition to due diligence or within the same amount of days if received from the very first to the execution date? They run simultaneously. So if we went under contract on Wednesday is day 0, Thursday is day 1, Friday is day 2, Saturday would have been day 3, but if it falls on a weekend or holiday, it rolls. So both condo review period, the condo review period would roll forward. It actually doesn't count the weekends, and then your due diligence period does. The funny thing, Dad, is if you had a 3-day inspection period and then the 3-day condo review period, they do count differently if you're starting on, say, a Friday, because the condo review period doesn't count Saturday, doesn't count Sunday. It would be Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday. So Wednesday would be the last day of condo review period. Whereas your inspection period would be Saturday, Sunday, Monday. Monday would be the last day of your
Monday was Memorial Day though, so we would have,
This week it was, yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And then someone else had a question. I missed why in some cases you can't take the full credit. It does have to do with the loan. So if there's a loan, if the buyer's ever considering getting a loan, you may not be able to take the full credit. There's a limit on how much you can take. There are federal guidelines, and it's also limited by the amount of your actual closing costs. So you might, be able to prepay, you might be able to buy down points on the loan. You could bump up the cost of your closing if you wanted to, but just realize there is that limitation. You just want to call the lender in advance.
well, the irony is, even though the contract gives you all these wonderful rights, your lender has the ultimate say-so.
Yep.
If you-
And from the seller's perspective, you got to play ball. If the buyer's getting a loan, we have new rules. If we fight it, the deal won't happen. If we try to understand it, we can see if there's something to be done, see if there's a deal to be had.
I do couple all this with, and it's counterintuitive, you should give them some inspection period just to protect yourself if you're the seller. And you should have an extremely thorough seller's disclosure, because especially in these expensive places,
Yeah.
those people have money and they can sue for things they find out after they move in, and they're going to find out something.
Yeah.
And you don't want to deal with an angry rich person.
So you unmuted yourself. Is there a question?
Yeah, hi, this is Yvette. Thank you. It's just your Zoom meetings are always very informative.
Oh, thank you.
I still don't understand what the advantage is of using the as-is contract versus the standard with the as-is addendum.
Oh, okay. So legally, there's no difference. The reason why I don't like the addendum is that people will point to parts of the sales contract that have been deleted by the addendum. So they'll look at what is a defect, and hey, that's cosmetic, and what about my election period? And you have to always remind them none of that is still in the contract. It was removed by the as-is addendum.
I believe
So-
NABOR though
But-
has one where you can go either way. If when the as-is period passes, then it defaults into the standard NABOR inspection mode. So
It's,
At that
but
point-
I think to me, Suzette, the big issue is managing expectations and negotiating with another side to say, I don't, yes, it might be cosmetic, but it's what my buyer requires. And if you're using the standard with the as-is addendum, you might have to explain that more than you want to. So I try to stay away from it just for that main reason.
But does the as-is contract also have some things missing from it that are part of the standard with the addendum, like things to do with permits and I don't know. I'm not
Yeah,
a lawyer,
it-
but
so-
don't you lose some things by using the as-is contract versus what I was describing?
It might make it more challenging if you're not following up and doing it in this way. So if you're not gathering all the things you require during your inspection period and then putting it in writing in an amendment, it is a more manual process in that manner. But you can still ask for permits to be closed out. You can still ask for repairs to be done. You can still do all of it. It's just that you have to almost create the form a little bit more manually. So, but the seller is still warranting under the as-is contract. It warrants. There are no known open permits or expired permits. It's just that it's more manual. To that point is that we did have an issue on one closing where the buyer's agent did not include the permit request in their amendment. I told him about it. We found it. We said, hey, please put this in an amendment, but he didn't do it. And the buyer ended up getting really upset, and the agent came out of pocket to cover that mistake. So it's just a more manual process that you have to be aware of.
I had this morning right before this podcast, and it was as is. And I was talking to the seller, and there were 3 open permits. 2 of them were electrical. One was an electrical panel, and the other one was another electrical panel for an above ground hot tub. And there's a statute that says the buyer cannot be penalized by the city of Marco in this situation for an open permit, but there is legal liability where the buyer has notice of this issue, and if you don't address it and some child gets hurt by touching an exposed wire, that they could be responsible under, gross negligence or simple negligence. So the seller is going to address these things even though they don't have to.
Yeah, and we always try to convince a seller to do the things that kind of create that goodwill. Just
Yeah.
the context matters, but at the end of the day, you only have what's in writing. So good questions with that. I appreciate you asking that. Hopefully that was very helpful. Just to remind you guys, these classes go on YouTube. You can easily find it, youtube.com/Christian Ross. I've probably got a couple of dozen videos up there now. And this one usually takes about a week to get on there. But if you have questions, reach out to either of us. And thanks for joining. I hope that was helpful. Bye, guys. Thanks,
Sure.
Dad.
Bye now.